From U.S. President Donald Trump.
I am always going to put America first, the same way that I expect all of you in this room to put your countries first.
To Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro.
My government foreign policy has its eyes on the rest of the world, but firstly on Brazil, to be in tune with the needs of our own society.
These right-wing populist leaders share similar views on economic protectionism and climate skepticism. We'll discuss the rise of populist nationalism across the globe and how it could shape 2020. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Around the world, numerous countries have witnessed a resurgence of strongman politics, with many governments embracing populist ideals. Leaders such as US President Donald Trump, Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, and the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi have come to power by making patriotic appeals to the people and railing against the elites. Immigration has also been a driving force of populist nationalism in Northern and Eastern Europe and the United States. For more on populist nationalism, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from London is Patrick Deneen. He's a professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame and author of Why Liberalism Failed. Here in our studio, Jack Janes is a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Rodrigo Constantino is an economist and author joining us from Miami, and from Cardiff in Wales via Skype, Andrew Dowling is a senior lecturer at Cardiff University. Welcome to all of you. Patrick Deneen, let me start with you in London. When we hear about the whole phenomenon of populism, nationalism, we hear various reasons being given on why this phenomenon is rising in the world today. We hear about globalization, about cultural differences, about immigration. Why do you think we are seeing this right now?
Well, I think in many ways this is the consequence of a kind of logic within the rise of the modern nation state, which was born alongside of liberal philosophy and the instantiation of liberalism as basically the protection and expansion of individual rights. And so for a long period of time, for centuries, it was believed and practiced that liberal rights were protected and guaranteed by nations. But increasingly what we're seeing is a kind of detachment of the assertion of individual rights from nations, and so that the freedom of the individual is now increasingly seen as needing to transcend national borders and national boundaries. And this is creating a kind of stress within those, I think, who are more likely to enjoy the kind of cosmopolitan internationalism, especially in a city like London behind me here, and those who feel themselves as more, in many ways, rooted in particular places. And I think this has manifested itself as a kind of international phenomenon, as a kind of nationalism that's global in scale.
And Patrick, have we seen this before, or is this the first time we're seeing something like this?
I think because precisely we have this globalized form of economic and sort of increasing integration internationally, this is a new phenomenon or new form of nationalism that's in particular, I think, a reaction to a certain kind of cosmopolitan liberalism.
Andrew Dowling, the American political scientist Francis Fukuyama, and I'm quoting here, he says populist nationalism constitutes the chief threat to the liberal international order that's been the foundation of global peace and prosperity since 1945. Do you agree with that?
I think there's a degree of exaggeration going on there. I think, for example, I agree with much of what your previous commentator Patrick just said. And I think there's a fracture around values going on, and it is often a fracture based around urban and rural or smaller based communities. But I think if we speak and think about things in global terms, we're not in a situation in most countries where we're going to be speaking about this afternoon, where we're entering a scenario such as Yugoslavia in the 1990s, where we're engaged in mass genocide, or Rwanda mass slaughter of populations is not occurring. So I think Fukuyama's perhaps, is attracting attention for himself with a very exaggerated statement. I think we should also bear in mind, I think this is another fracture, if you want, that one of the things we also see is a division within within countries. So it's not necessarily against immigrants, but also within European societies, there are people saying, this is what it's like to be a true patriot, or this is what it's like to be a true nationalist. We see this in America, we see this in Latin America, and they're saying to, if you want, to Britons or to people in France or Italy or many countries around the world, that if you have certain values, which are these cosmopolitan values, you are not a true Briton, or you are not a true American, or you are not a true Chilean, and so on and so forth. So I think I would very much want to frame it around values, and I don't think it is the greatest threat posed to humanity at this current point.
Rodrigo Constantino, as Andrew Darling says, he would frame this around values. But does race have to play a role in this? I mean, you take Brazil's president, Jair Bolsonaro, for instance. He's a populist, a nationalist. He's made some racist comments about the country's indigenous population. Is there an element of race in all of this?
Actually, I don't think so. I think, of course, we should be worried about some excesses, but I think, in a sense, it's a healthy reaction to the cosmopolitan liberalism that closed itself in a kind of bubble, too left-wing bubble, and ignored some values with the help of the mainstream media. So Brexit, for example, is against not globalization itself, but globalism, which is a different phenomenon. In Brazil, I think Bolsonaro is a reaction against the left-wing government that almost destroy our democracy and destroy our economy. And the same goes for Trump in the United States. And the economy is growing, the minorities are protected in a sense, that there's not fascism going on. So yeah, in some kind of excess, there is the white supremacist guys that are probably together with Trump or Bolsonaro in Brazil, but they are not the majority. They are not a bunch of deplorables, as Hillary Clinton said. They are people, regular people, ordinary people reacting to a lot of wrong things that were going on in those democracies.
Jack, we've seen a right-wing populist shift in many European countries, Hungary, Italy, among others. What role has immigration and the refugee crisis played in this? And also, many Europeans see their culture, Central European culture, being threatened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that what we've been hearing from my other three colleagues here is down the line of something that some people call is the reaction against an unresponsive government. And to some extent, it's about economic insecurity, although it's sometimes ironic that some of these countries that produce the kind of right-wing populism are not necessarily in economic straits. Look at Germany, for example. And so I think, and the third thing is that there is this sense of ethnic, if you will, or national identity that's being threatened. It used to be back in the 90s when we had the Clinton administration trying to get into the White House, it was all about the economy, stupid. I'm not sure it's the economy, stupid, in this particular case in all context. I think it's more a sense of what some people say. I've forgotten exactly the individual in London that coined this phrase. We have people that are everywhere at home, and there are people that are somewhere at home. And the somewheres and the everywheres represent the kind of conflict that my former colleagues here have already expressed. So I think there is a mix of things, but there's not just one thing that makes this populist development happen.
Patrick, what are your thoughts on how economic conditions factor into the rise of populism?
Well, what we've clearly seen is, again, as a global phenomenon, is the rise of a kind of, let's say, a kind of international globalized capitalism, again, which tends to pretty brutally sift winners from losers. And I do think this is one area where you do see a kind of divide between a kind of urban and more rural population, with the suburban population sort of often siding with the urban population. So this is certainly one aspect. At the same time, I think I would agree with I think all the comments that have just been stated, that while it's undoubted that the economy plays a significant role in the rise of this populism, I think alongside of this, and I think the last commentator was referring to a book by David Goodhart about somewhere and anywhere people, that it's the experience of one's not just economic life, but one's sort of social life, one's familial life, whether that's in some ways seen as a kind of no experience of being anywhere or the capacity to live anywhere easily, or in some ways a kind of again, a sense of rootedness and a sense of membership and belonging. So we're seeing a really fascinating, it seems to me, a moment where this is a global phenomenon. It's not just one nation. So we talk often about nationalism, but it's really a kind of, it's itself a globalized response of people in many different nations with all the national particularities that I think we have to account for, but a response to a globalized economic order that's produced these, I think, this insecurities of values, these social phenomena that aren't merely reducible to economic factors.
Yeah, in fact, President Trump's former advisor, Steve Bannon, he talked about this, talked about the definition of populism. This is what he had to say. Let's watch.
What economic nationalism is about. And it's not about your race, your color, your gender, your religion, your ethnicity, your sexual preference. It's about one thing. Are you a citizen of the United States of America? Because if you're a citizen, there's certain responsibility and obligations that come with that. But as a citizen also, you should have preference for jobs and economic opportunities.
And of course, Patrick, listening to Steve Bannon there, this is where we get President Trump's America First agenda. Is this sustainable in the long term?
Well, you know, what's really interesting is listening to that clip is that if you were to play this clip and date it in the 1960s or the 1950s, you would almost invariably say that that was an argument that was made by somebody on the political left. This was a very typical argument a half a century ago by figures dating back to the Kennedy administration, the president the priest president that founded my university, Theodore Hesburgh, a kind of icon of the liberal civil rights movement, who was the head of an immigration commission who argued for the need of sort of controls on immigration to sort of save and preserve domestic jobs, and especially working class jobs. So it's really striking that we now consider this to be sort of obviously a right-wing phenomenon, when this in many ways might have once been considered a kind of kind of what they would call a kind of lunch bucket working class issue. And I think it reflects some really fascinating changing dynamics of the political parties that we're certainly see playing out in the United States. We're seeing right now in the election that's taking place here in England, in which the Tory party is increasingly becoming the working class party and vice versa, where you have labor increasingly losing the laboring classes. So it really is a striking phenomenon to just simply sort of describe this as a right versus left phenomenon, when it seems to me we're really scrambling categories because of changing economic, social, political conditions. Yeah, certainly turns everything on its head. Andrew Darling, I want to talk about regional nationalism, especially in Europe. Could the rise of regional nationalism lead to the fragmentation of states? I mean, I'm thinking of countries like Spain, where we see the Catalans looking for independence, the Basque region in Spain as well, which has long been looking for that. I mean, could it lead to the breakup of these states? We're seeing the same in one of the unintended consequences of Brexit could be the breakup of the United Kingdom. Absolutely.
Yeah, these are all, I think these are mostly phenomenon that are kind of separate from the broader debate. Because one of the things that I'd want to say is, I think we have to be careful when we're talking about nationalism to not simply say that nationalism is the same as populism or nationalism is the same as authoritarianism. Because I think, for example, in the case of, say, Scottish nationalism or Catalan nationalism, these are broadly open, progressive movements, and they certainly don't bear resemblances to what's going on in, for example, Brazil or even Trump's America. So they're much more about defending their identity against states that they feel don't take them into account, don't take them into consideration. But clearly, should any of these regions achieve a form of independence in the future, has major implications for the European Union. It has major implications for the European Union because, of course, there are a whole range of potential border disputes in Europe. And I think part of the reason why the European Union has been so reluctant or so unwilling to support, for example, the Catalans and others, is because you open a Pandora's box once you start allowing the emergence of new states, and then you have potential conflicts. For example, with Romania and Hungary, you've got a substantial Hungarian minority in Romania. You've got all these kind of unresolved issues, mostly from the Second World War, from the end of the Second World War. So it does have potential to be a destabilizing force. I think for now it's unlikely, but you know, the whole Brexit phenomenon is of course, again, an interesting manifestation of so many things. And one thing I'd like to bring in, actually, that I think is an interesting phenomenon as well, and we're seeing it with the populist economic element. What I see is a fracture going on in general terms between traditional business elites. There's a fracture going on between, if you want, a nationalist business elite, which seeks protectionism and seeks the state, and Boris Johnson and all these others talking about how we're going to defend British industry. And then you've got a kind of global internationalist elite that was dominant over the course of the 1990s, dominant for most of the past 25, 30 years, that it's losing its dominance. And even in the Catalan movement, they're saying, so I think these are things that we also need to consider as well.
Yeah. Rodrigo, one of the features that is, and I'm talking broadly, one of the features that we see that is common to nationalist leaders in this day and age is their skepticism about climate change. Let's listen to Brazil's president, Jair Bolsonaro.
We cannot sign an agreement whose objectives are impossible for us to achieve. After all, Brazil does not owe the world anything when it comes to environmental protection.
So there we hear the president of Brazil telling us that Brazil doesn't owe the world anything when it comes to climate change. But most climate change scientists and activists will tell you that, will point to the crucial role that the Amazon plays in actually reducing carbon levels throughout the world. So has Jair Bolsonaro got something wrong there?
Yeah, I think it goes for the difference between globalism and globalization, and their sovereignty that is in risk here. Those countries are fighting for their rights to decide their policy. And the climate change issue became a very international way of creating a kind of global government that's going to interfere and decide every detail in each country. So people don't accept it. They don't buy for the alarmism regarding the climate change issue and all that. So again, if you go to extremes, nationalism is against other people, patriotism is for your people. I think the same goes here. It's not that the country, the Brazil, is not they don't care about what's going on in the climate change in the world. It's just that they don't want Macron and France deciding about our Amazon forest. And I think it makes sense, actually.
That is a great point that Rodrigo raises there, Jack, and that is the fear of global governance, of global government.
It is, and I think that really does, however, raise the question, is there such a thing as a global good? And I think in that respect, it can be that we have to argue about global governance and who has responsibilities for what. But I would not want to question the fact that there is a global good. I mean, the health of the planet is one of them. The other question I want to throw into this mix, though, is this question of who is we? Who speaks for whom here? Because the assumption that whether it's Trump saying America first, or maybe polarizing the society, in my view, a little bit in the sense of saying those that don't agree with me are not part of we. This is the problem that I also saw in Britain during the debate over Brexit recently, where Boris Johnson would talk about surrender politics and so forth, so that another factor involved, not only the economics, not only the nationalism, and not only unresponsive governments, which is a factor. Yeah. It's personalities that are playing a role here that see an opportunity to take advantage of that.
But we do hear the us and them argument being made all the time.
All the time. Yeah. But in this case, I think it's much more polarizing.
One other point, Jack, and that is something that Patrick raised earlier on. And, you know, is it too easy for us to divide this into issues of left and right? Because if we look at, say, the policies of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Chavismo as it became to be known, he could hardly be considered a right-winger, but he could be considered a populist and a nationalist, couldn't he?
Right. I mean, some people say that when you get so far left, you walk around to the right-hand side. So in that respect, we're talking about fringe politics trying to usurp for themselves what the issues are. No, I think that's problematic because parties, and we can see that all through Europe and to some extent in the United States as well, parties are changing their constituencies. Parties are chasing their voters. And in some ways, they may be reacting to what they see out there. This is certainly the case in Germany, I think. And in that way, I think that the question is, again, I come back to the question, what's the notion of we in a state? that can be a common ground for people to say, in the name of we will confront this problem, or we will deal with that challenge. And that, I think, is at risk at the moment.
Patrick, we see widespread inequality in the world today. We see lots being written about that, vast wealth being concentrated in the hands of just a few. It's typified here in the United States by what we call the 1%. How has wealth and income inequality contributed to these political phenomena that we're seeing? Yeah, I think it's doubtless the case that the concentration of wealth that's, again, become a global phenomenon, certainly we see it in extreme form in the United States today, has contributed to a deep kind of resentment, and especially a resentment of people who consider themselves to be sort of ordinary people, the common man, the common woman, paying their taxes, playing by the rules, and especially when, as has been evident over the last several decades, when wealth not only entitles you to greater purchasing power, but the ability to manipulate the system to your advantage. And we've certainly seen this in recent years, wealthy people being able to ensure that their children get entrance to the best schools, a recent scandal in the United States. During 2008 economic crisis, the bankers being able to arrange bailouts when people whose homes were underwater had to walk away from those homes and those mortgages and suffer the consequences of bankruptcy. So I think it's not only a matter of wealth, it's a real question of whether or not a society now formed like ours can ensure fairness. And I think a part of what we see as this populist backlash is a real demand for a kind of redress of not just economic inequality, but sort of equality for a system that works in fairness and justness to everyone, regardless of your status and situation. Andrew Darling, we were talking earlier on about the threat that nationalism poses to the liberal order, and as you pointed out, Francis Fukuyama could be exaggerating the threat. But is there a risk that the differences that we are seeing could manifest itself in conflict, in war?
Well, that's always a risk. But I think it's very interesting that we're, at the end of 3 years of Donald Trump in power, and I think probably most commentators 3 years ago have been surprised that there's been no war led by Donald Trump. So I would anticipate that would have caused widespread surprise. So again, I think there is a degree of exaggeration around this. I think nationalism, again, I'm separating it from populism, nationalism in some form has always been around. If we think back to, for example, the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher was a very proud, patriotic Britain. So was Ronald Reagan as president of the United States of America. It's not unreasonable to call them nationalists, but we wouldn't call them populists necessarily. Yeah. So I think now we've got the meshing of those two phenomena. It's not that I'm optimistic, but I don't see that serious conflict is on the horizon. I think the problems are internal to societies. I think the problems are to do with borders and closing borders and protection. And I think what we're also seeing, again, importantly, linked to many of the points people have made, is political emotions, fear, worry, concern, anxiety, preoccupation about, jobs for the future, jobs for their children, jobs for their grandchildren. All these are into the mix as well.
Rodrigo, to what do you attribute the rise of a leader like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil? I mean, is it a cyclical thing in Brazil that the pendulum shifts from left to right and then back to the left again?
It was about corruption in the left-wing party, in the government. It's about values. It's about the mainstream media that's become too far to the left. So I think it's a kind of reaction. In a way, it's a healthy reaction. In another way, no. And also it has a lot to do with the social media. I think we cannot ignore that. The social media put democracy, representative democracy, on check. And people now have a way to come together and try to fight those mainstream media and the elites. So I think the populism has a lot to do with that. What I'm afraid of is the tribalism. Is that mentality that is binary, like me and you, and we are against each other all the time, so there's no room for dialogue and to reach a kind of agreement. So that's what worries me, not the patriotism, not the right-wing government. It's not a big deal. So I think we need to consider the social media impact as a factor and also tribalism as a risk.
I agree.
Jack, Rodrigo mentioned social media there. What role has technology, modern technology, played in these changes that we're seeing? Because you can get the word out pretty fast now with social media.
Yeah, and you can tribalize it fairly quickly as well. I remember when Tom Friedman, New York Times, was writing about the fact that this new world was going to be flat. Everybody could plug in and play. But that's not happened. And I think what we're seeing is this tribalism within that social media. I come back to my question about whether or not that's creating a zero-sum type thinking. We over here have the truth. You don't. And that can be done with the social media basically supporting it. So who's we here? And I think that that's the problem that we're going to have to face. How do we avoid what our colleague said, the tribalism and the zero-sum thinking that goes into that? And we can do it if we want to, because the social media allows us to stay within our silos. That's the danger. It's also an opportunity, but it goes both ways.
Patrick Deneen, one of the biggest differences we have seen recently between China and the United States is the whole idea of globalization. We're talking about two of the world's biggest economies here. They view it very differently. China, of course, embraces globalization, while President Trump rejects it. Is the US rejection of globalization part of this populism that we see in the United States?
It may have something to do with a kind of a difference in the sort of development of these two nations. China is really sort of entering into a modern sort of post-industrial economy. And in the same way that in the 1980s and the 1990s, globalization proved to be very good for the American economy, it also proved to be detrimental, especially for the average person who would have typically made their living from a more local industry, many of which those jobs got shipped overseas, including to places like China. So in some senses, one might not be surprised that at some point in time, China might not experience similar kinds of internal conflicts. It just seems to me that right now in the United States, after a period of especially a kind of globalization that tended to benefit one part of the population over another part of the population, we shouldn't be surprised to see that there was a kind of a backlash electorally in the form that we now describe as populism, and which we can, I think, expect to see defining an increasing divide within American and I think also much of European politics for the foreseeable future.
Andrew, one final point. I was looking at a piece by John Pfeffer at the Institute for Policy Studies, who sees this phenomenon of the rise of populism, the rise of nationalism, as a left and right issue. And he says the rise of populism, the rise of nationalism has put the left on the defensive. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think part of the problem for the left in general terms is the intensity of attachment that people feel to the nation, to the homeland, to a sense of patriotism. And it's always been a struggle for the left because the traditional left, whether radical or social democratic, has embraced internationalist values, and internationalist values are being challenged today. So it's very hard. If you're looking at the British general election campaign, it's so much easier for the Conservatives in a new kind of like populist form to embrace flying the flag. And, Jeremy Corbyn struggles to articulate that. And we see that playing out across the world, where it's very, very difficult for the left to feel comfortable with notions of nation and notions of patriotism. So it is a big problem for the broad left.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.